dear friends. Julian, thank you very much for inviting me here. So, my talk will be something in the middle between this abstract theoretical frame and, let's say, the more concrete case studies and historical detailed pictures we listen from the first two speakers. I'll talk about empires in imagination in the 9th century, although the question is strongly connected with what is happening today, but this will be maybe in the discussion. So my talk will be divided in 4 parts. The first 2 are theoretical, the third and the fourth are concrete and historical. I start with some comments to the project Jan Sova proposed to us, and I read it as a kind of attempt this is a quote, attempt to construct a story of capitalism as it was experienced not by the winners, Western European powers, but by the press, a kind of Benjaminian project. I read it as a proposal for counter-universal history, reading the world history as a story of globalization of dependence, underdevelopment and slavery, an ironic universalization of East European condition that made everybody a slave, not by their ethnic identity, but by their social, political and economic situation. The cultural situation is missing here. This was a quote from your letter. So, I start here with some critical objections made by feminists and post-colonial thinkers to the problem of universality of historical time. This topic has been addressed first by Reinhard Koselleck in his famous slogan that history became collective singular, that means universal history, someone between 16,000 and the 16th and the 18th centuries. That means it became universal, all-inclusive narrative, of course Eurocentric narrative, and it was supported by universally accepted chronology. Of course this imposition was not non-violent, but this is another story. And in this process, next to the historical agencies, a lot of ahistorical peoples remain, and Hegel is explicit about that. He divides people in historical and ahistorical people, and African and of course Balkan people are ahistorical. I don't know about the Polish guys. Are they in the history or not, from the point of view of Hegel? So the post-colonial thinkers demonstrated that, I speak here about of course, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and a lot of others. They demonstrated that these historical people are living outside the universal time because they live in other non-existing narratives, fragmented, discontinued, with missing logic. These are traumatic times or traumatic narratives. So, I would like to remind you of the famous first line of War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, that happy families are all alike. Unfortunately, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. That is to say that maybe there is no counter-universal history possible. The statement, all peoples from the peripheries are Slavs or slaves, is of course a trope. Legitimate trope, but nevertheless universalistic hyperbole. In fact, there are many different non-similar histories which have to be reconstructed in their traumatic differences. A very difficult task because it's an enormous task. It's not to sketch one universal scheme of history. It's to sketch at the same time many histories, a kind of plurality, or maybe less plurality of histories. It is to reconstruct a plurality of stories about slavery, conquest, repression, dependence, exploitation, lack of recognition, lack of autonomy, underdevelopment, backwardness, chaos, lack of trust, but also stories about disgust, mimicry, poaching, trickster stories. Sometimes, not always, stories about resistance and struggle. And all these are different stories. I don't believe that there is a reduction possible to a common denominator of a happy family. So we are confronting this impossible plurality in a way, and I don't know how to deal with it, how to cope with it. Nevertheless, maybe Jan Sova is right to stress this need, because there are certain meta-similarities, not on the level of content, but on the level of form. Marginalized communities are never narrators. They are narrated. They are part of the symbolic order, or the grand narrative, which is not their own. Then why should not go to their own symbolic order? Because their own symbolic order, the grand narrative or their own historicity, has been lost, or maybe never existed. Maybe their very identities have been constructed in this traumatic way, but the discourse is a powerful other. And they do not have other normal, non-traumatic history and non-traumatic identity. So this is once again a quotation from Beatrice Spivak. The true subaltern cannot speak because there is no universal self-transparent subaltern subject that can speak and know itself. Self-transparent subject. They don't have a language and a narrative of their own. Their identity is their difference. Difference to the hegemonic code. So, saying this theoretical introduction, I'll proceed with some more theory. Because I'm going to speak about social imagination, I would like to, not to define, but to clear my concept. What is social imagination? I follow here Charles Taylor, who says that social imagination usually implies a background of intuitive knowledge, a body of stereotypes shared by a community, a widely shared pre-theoretical reservoir of shared perceptions, both descriptive and prescriptive. And I will further assume that this reservoir is structured as a historical narrative. And this social imagination rules the dreams, the longings, the phantasma shared by the members of certain social group. That means we are speaking here about domination, or better, about hegemony over the imagination, about internalization of the hegemonic cultural values, about self-stigmatizing and traumatic subjectivation, the traumatic force of the collective imagination, which claims we are not real Europeans. Actually, this is a quote from a famous Bulgarian novel called Baiganio, maybe some of you know about it, where the narrator says, we are European, but not to the end. So there is a kind of ambivalence in this. So my concept of self-colonization is strongly connected with the concept of imagination. The conquer of the imagination of the repressed, the dream about the West, the so-called Europeanization, is practically the ultimate form of power. It's symbolic variant. The maps of the real empires and the empires of the imagination do not coincide. The real cartography and the ideal cartography are different. The ideal West is bigger than the real West. And this form of power, I claim, the conquer of the imagination, could be called self-colonization. I could call it also Californication, if you like. Actually, there is a nice American joke from one popular movie. Two characters are trying to rob a bank, and this attempt was very successful, and they were so full of joy that the first says to the second, in case we do the same once again, I'll bring you to California. And the second said, but we are in California. The difference. So you can imagine that this realm, the realm of imagination, is not a calm realm. It's full of conflicts, tensions, and struggles. One can say that the different social groups have different group imaginations, and these imaginations are in ceaseless conflicts and competitions. And this do not coincide with the practical rivalries of realpolitik described by, let's say, military or diplomatic historiography. There is one hegemonic phantasm, and this hegemonic phantasm has been called Europe. After that, it was called the West Atlantic Alliance and so on, but it's a phantasm about progress, modernization, Europeanization, Westernization, about, shortly, universal civilization. It's a universal dream. And of course, it produces immediately its own otherness, and this is the Orient. This is the suppressed otherness, laziness, backwardness, barbarity, eroticism, femininity, irrationality. These are the two, let's say, the binary couple, West and Orient, Occident and Orient, a very old phantasm, which has, of course, its rivals in the imaginaries of the different ethnic and cultural alternative groups, peripheral groups. And one can understand nationalism as a kind of resistance towards the force of modernization and Europeanization. The image, the imaginary image of the great mother nation, with its own emancipation, with its own political independence, with its own cultural autochthonism and authenticity, is the strongest alternative of Europeanization, although sometimes on, let's say, the ideological surface, they are presented as alliances, not as rivals. And we can understand also pan-Slavism from this perspective, its dream about alternative universal community, the so-called Slav Sea, an ideal Eastern Empire. And historically and politically, pan-Slavism has two major variants. The first could be called Russian variant. It's the dream about pan-Slavism under Russian rule. And the second is the Czech variant, union of plurality of small nations, which give birth to a new great power. So, in part two, this is part three actually, sorry, I will speak about my own place, the Balkans, Southeastern Europe, and its historic situation. First, I should introduce certain well-known facts about the function of realpolitik on that place. The Balkans were always a place of rivalries and conflict between great multi-ethnic empires, and I am speaking about the 19th century and before. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, rivalries about sea routes and spheres of influence of the British and the French empires too. At the same time, Southeast Europe was a place of micro-rivalries and conflicts between ethnic religious groups and national liberation movements. Turks, Greeks, Serbs, Croats, Slovenians, Macedonians, Romanians, Bulgarians, Albanians, Jews, Gagos, Romas, etc., etc., etc. A lot of minorities. So, we can define this realpolitik as a pluralistic set of economic, military and diplomatic forces which shape the fate of Southeast Europe, changing historical dynamics of this constellation, reshaping of boundaries, loyalties, dependencies, identities and whatever. At the same time, the realpolitik is doubled by a kind of cultural paradox, which is as follows. After this disintegration of the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire, a plurality of small independent national states were established. Their real boundaries do not coincide with their imaginary borders. And there was a lot of conflict between the imaginary homelands. The Greek megalia idea, the dream Great Romania, the Great Serbia, the Great Albania, the Great Bulgaria, the so-called irredentism. This led to a lot of conflicts and wars, especially before the First World War and after. Yet, the map of these pure national cultures contradicts to the anthropological realities of this place. One can speak about split between, first, the official mutually hostile national high cultures, which are Romanian, Greek, Bulgarian, and so on, and the cultures of everyday Balkan life, very similar to each other. So there are great differences in the ideological national grand narratives, and the great similarities in housing, cooking, clothing, rituals, bodily culture, mentalities, etc. So nation states try to govern this anthropological plurality, and this gave birth to a lot of national policies of purification and homogenization of the minorities and the real everyday multiculturalism of the population. This brought Hellenization, Serbization, Bulgarianization, Romanianization, and so on into the place. And after the wars, it had certain consequences, very bloody consequences. After the recent war, also ethnic cleansing, forced migrations, and so on. So, we can speak about the possible horizons of the Balkan imagination. That means the dreams of the high cultures. And I make a kind of very rude sketch here. The Hellenic self-centering of Greece, which represents itself as parallel of European civilization, the Latin origins of Romanians, Bulgaria split between Diablo Ivan, that is the idolized popular image of Russia, and Germany. You know that Bulgarians are the Protestant as Balkans. Serbia between Russia and the distant Western empires. Here we can interpret the role of real, not metaphorical, pan-Slavism in this context. It is a transboundary, distant connections, a dream to connect to the Poles, to the Czechs, to the Slovaks, to the Croats, to disappear into the great Slavic sea, so to say. And Balkan Slavs have been always split between their own autochthonic myths and pan-Slavism. And one more particular feature in this sketch, the so-called Balkanization. This is a popular Western discourse about the Balkans, investigated by a lot of scholars, including myself, which represents the Balkans with stable stereotypes. The dark Balkans, in German, Kleinstaaterei, that means vague plurality of small states, which nobody cares to distinguish from each other. The powder box, the abyss of civilization. In general, public stereotypes have been formulated by Maria Todorova as the shameful oriental semi-other of Europe. The discourse of Balkanism is the discourse of the powerful other, the West, and is the rival background against which all nationalistic, autochthonic and pan-Slavic local discourses should be developed and evaluated. So this was my theoretical part. Now I'm going to the third and to the second part, to the fourth part of my presentation. It is about one person, Alexander Todorov Balan, a very interesting person, which has been thrown in this frame of pan-Slavism, Bulgarianism, Westernization, and so on. You will see. This is Professor Alexander Todorov Balan. He was a long-lived person, almost 100 years. Born in the village of Kubey, Bessarabia, in the family of Bulgarian immigrants. His early childhood he spent in a situation of multicultural and multilingual environment. The mother of Alexander Todorov Balan spoke 5 languages: Bulgarian, Turkish, Romanian, Greek, and Russian. He went to the local school. For that local school, he remembers that he didn't know whether he's Bulgarian or not. in a way, his national identity was not a real issue for him at that time. At the age, let's say, of 10, 11, 12. After that, he started to visit the Belgrade Gymnasium, but before introducing the Belgrade Gymnasium, some historical information about Bessarabia, a small part of land between Ukraine and Romania. So at that land first was established the Principality of Moldavia, an Ottoman vassal, established in 1359, and the boundaries were the Carpathian Mountains in the west, the Dniester River in the east, the Danube and the Black Sea in the south. After the Russo-Turkish War, the first one, 1806-1812, parts of Moldavia go into the frontiers of Imperial Russia, and they form the oblast region of Moldavia and Bessarabia and a large degree of autonomy. After 1828, autonomy progressively has been restricted both from Romanian and from Russian side. However, after 1856, after the Crimean War, Bessarabia was divided into two parts, the southern part of Moldavia, the northern part of Russia. 1861, it has been transformed into, in Russia, the Russian part has been transformed to the Bessarabia Governorate, state-imposed assimilation and Russification. The Romanian or the Moldavian part exists as autonomous state until 1859, when it joins Wallachia to give birth to the United Principalities of Romania, and after that the Kingdom. Russian rule was restored in Bessarabia in 1878 after the Russo-Turkish War, when Romania, the successor of Moldavia, was pressured to exchange those territories for Dobruja. You see this panel between Russian, Romanian, Ottoman and other rules, which is very important. Here are some maps of Bessarabia, both old and contemporary, relatively new. You see the Soviet Union and Romania are here. During the existence of Great Romania, you see Bessarabia, and next to it is the Soviet Union. Now Bessarabia is split between Ukraine and Romania. So the Bessarabian population looks like that. In 1856, you see that the Bulgarians at that time, and together with the Gagauls, they have nothing to do with each other, but in the statistic they were together. They were about 5%, and let's say about 40 years after that, they were about 5.3%, which means a stable minority. It has been established by ceaseless Bulgarian immigrations to Bessarabia following the Russo-Turkish Wars. And the town of Belgrade has been established in 1819 by Bulgarian immigrants. So, this was the Belgrade Gymnasium the young Alexander Teodorov Balan started to visit, and it played a crucial role in his development. What about its school policy? It has been established with a foundational document called Kiossev, where the cultural independence of the Bulgarian minority was supported, opened on the 1st of May 1859, and it gradually became one of the centers of the Bulgarian national cultural movement in the 19th century. It gathered important figures as teachers and students. Nevertheless, in the school policy, one can mention a kind of this paneling of different political trends, starting with this initial imbalance between Romanian cultural policy and Bulgarian cultural policy. It started to be Romanized, Russified, Bulgarianized, and so on, which brought, of course, rivalries among the students. So, Balan was strongly influenced by some of his teachers, especially by the teacher Vasil Stoyanov, who was at that time already a founding member of the Bulgarian Society of Letters, later the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. So he, all of a sudden, he started to feel Bulgarian. There was a birth of patriotic self-conscious in the young Balan. And he started to develop interest in history of Bulgarian language, Slavic languages, history, and ethnography. During that time, in the age of 15, he was involved, of course, in personal rivalries with some other young patriots, Romanian patriots. What he didn't know that his school environment at that time already was full of future Bulgarian ministers, state officials, scholars, writers, public figures. He was already part of the Bulgarian elite without knowing it. After that, with the protection of Vasil Stoyanov, he went to Europe and studied Slavonic philologies in the best scholarly centers of Europe by the best linguists of his time. First in Prague by Professor Jan Gebauer, prominent Czech linguist, and another one, Professor Martin Hatala, also a very important figure. After that, introduced with recommendations by Gebauer and another important person, Konstantin Irček, he went to Leipzig and was student of Professor August Leskin, one of the most important German linguists. He was Slavist and Pan-Slavist at the same time. Balance writes a dissertation there. At that time, he started participating in Bulgarian patriotic or student organization, which was in rivalries with other patriotic organizations, and not only rivalry, but also union with the other Slavs. He was a Pan-Slavist on a practical basis, so to say, but inside this Pan-Slavic circle, there was strong tensions. And in 1884, he returns to Sofia. And there, what he is expected, so to say, by a really quick academic and official career. All of a sudden, the young Balan was put to the post of head of the Department of Slavonic Ethnography, Dialectology and History of Bulgarian Language in the high school. And 1 year after that, he was elected to be the first rector of the first Bulgarian university in Sofia. He was elected for this post 2 more times then, and then he was dean of the Faculty of Philology, head of the Department of Bulgarian and Slavonic Literatures, and a lot of other positions. He established himself in his long life path as one of the leading Bulgarian linguists and also author of the first Bulgarian literary history. These were his scholarly field, a typical philologist. So, and I'm going to my conclusion because I'm already over my time. How can we interpret this life path? What happened to this young guy? And who are was not so young, of course. So let's analyze certain layers of his biographical trajectory. Kuwait, Belgrade, Prague, Leipzig, Sofia. A trajectory very different from the trajectory of the emigrants described by Anna. Then, he was a pupil student member of the Bulgarian Academy of Science, rector, professor, and at the same time important state official. What about the consequences of the ideologically burdened social roles in this biographical trajectory? He started with a child with no clear identity. Then he was transformed into a young Bulgarian patriot, then into a Slavist scholar. Then he found himself in the position of modernizer of the Bulgarian education in a Western manner. And he ended in his late years as cultural nationalist and linguistic purist. Actually, at that time, in his late years, there was a lot of jokes about the linguistic inventions of Balan in Bulgaria. At the same time, we should mention that his career and life path has been observed by important figures, father figures, who took care about the career of the young Alexander Theodorou Balan. These were his teacher, but also the most important Slavists of his time. Jan Gebauer, Professor Konstantin Ireček, Professor Marin Zinov in Kharkov, Professor Ivan Shishmanov in Sofia, and so on. They took care about the fate of the young, talented Bala. So, I will skip this because I don't have really time for that. I will skip this because I don't have really time for that. To interpret dreams is not so easy. I interpret this as a kind of personal story of self-realization, and as a kind of evidence. I'll bring here a quotation from the memoir about myself, Bala wrote in his late years. There he confesses that in his mature years he has practically forgotten the Balkan languages he commanded as a child. He forgotten Greek, Turkish and Romanian. Instead, he acquired a professional command of almost all Slavic languages. In addition, he also commanded German and French. His wife was French. So in his long life, he moved from a non-prestigious Orient condition, multilingual and multicultural Balkan and Bessarabic child, to another highly prestigious, multilingual and multicultural condition, that of Slavic scholar of eternal prominence and of Bulgarian distinguished scholar and educational state official. This position can be regarded as kind of socially accepted compromise between Westernization and Pan-Slavism, as a compromise loaded with academic authority and prestige. His career has been driven by powerful collective phantasms, but imagination here means already something quite different from the bold collective and personal dreams. It means established institutional patterns and clear role models. His biographical trajectory clearly demonstrates that the social imaginations were already transformed into stabilized realities and clear career routes, procedural role models and desirable institutional positions. Bala's career was almost predetermined by these patterns, and in addition, it involved his personal desires and identifications. So I end with these final questions, which are questions to the project of a counter-universal history. Is this a personal of one of the repressed or not? Is it possible to universalize this personal biographical trajectory? How should we interpret the metaphor of self-colonization in this particular case? I'm just trying to demonstrate the difficulties of this plurality, enormous plurality of various stories, which is really threatening, which is really giving place to certain fears.